What if a client says, I want to add a bunch of stuff to the contract. I got to take it through my legal people. They have lots of questions. They don't like this. They don't want this. What's your response to that? Hey, I'm Joe Mathis.
And I'm Todd Wade, welcome to the Joe and Todd Show.
This is exciting. This is fun.
This is our first podcast interview. How about that?
Yes. And we have invited Laura Packard, who is an attorney and has worked with all kinds of stuff through the years, done a lot of mortgage and housing and just all kinds of stuff, but she's one of our key advisors. We have 3 attorneys that we use, just for disclaimer. We have 3 attorneys that we use, and Laura is the one who's kind of helped us through with contracts and actually this last season of COVID and kind of that sort of thing. And so we asked her to come on today and just kind of think through with us what it means to be an event planner, and then to kind of what we have to think about in a contract. And my first advice, and we probably will say this 10 times in this episode, is find an attorney. I've told people over and over, the best things you can do when you go into business is get an accountant, get an attorney, get legal advice, and get something for marketing.
And good insurance.
And good insurance. Yes. Yes. Good insurance and a good banker. Anyway, that's what we're talking about today, right? What's the title?
Yeah. So last week we talked about getting a proposal together, and that was part 1. So then part 2 is basically the next step in the process is, of course, moving in, getting a contract signed with your client. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And let's see. So it says, gather your notes from your presentation. Who knows what that means?
Those are really helpful. Well, Laura,
you know what that means, Laura?
From your,
I can guess. So my assumption is you're talking about the scope of services involved in the contract, and that is obviously the key point. It may seem obvious to you at the time what event you're contracting for, but it doesn't matter. Even if you've done the same event over and over, you need a solid outline of the scope of services and what you intend to provide, as well as what the other contracting party will provide. So,
yeah, that's very good. What if you had someone call you today and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about starting an event business. What do I even need to think about when I'm putting together a basic agreement for clients?" What would your basic advice be?
Well, in terms of an agreement, so there's several different directions you can go here. Obviously the main things are your scope of service, your payment schedule, things like that. Those are the things obviously you've already probably discussed via a proposal with your client. But there's always the legal protections that come with standard contracts. They're probably things you're familiar with in other walks of life. Indemnity, severability, things like that. Also, in event planning specifically, you're going to have termination, cancellations, force majeure, which we've talked a lot about recently in light of COVID. So you kind of, in a way, the agreement needs to also contemplate the actions of third parties or acts outside of your control. So, in general, any attorney will tell you that a contract is in place to protect everyone involved. There's no reason to approach a contract with the idea that you're one-upping someone or getting something over on someone. That's not what a contract is for. It should be 2 equal parties with a basic understanding of what's going to happen.
That's a really
and
good
it's
point.
Again, they're in place to protect all. So.
Oh, that's good stuff. You used a lot of big words. You used indemnity, severability, termination. Yeah, tell us. Just give us some layman's approach to what some of those words mean.
So, and a basic deal for our podcast is, we've kind of been around for 50, 55 years, and we've heard a lot of those words flying around, and but you deal with those all the time, and you're very familiar with them. But our goal here with the podcast is to help younger event planners, beginning event planners, understand kind of the ins and outs of business, and in this case, contracts and legalities. So if you can just do some easy definitions of those words, that'll help some of our listeners, hopefully.
Well, we'll start with the easiest one that you probably know and are familiar with, which is termination of a contract. And it's going to sound redundant a bit, but it's terms of that termination or cancellation, and that's just reasons for which things didn't work out, that could be foreseeable at the time. We'll talk in a minute about unforeseeable circumstances, but things that could happen reasonably, and reasons that you would want to terminate the agreement. Or at times it may mean that you're just terminating one contract to propose another. So it's not as negative as it might sound. So to dive further in, cancellation, since we're talking about event planning, cancellation of the event wouldn't always mean you're terminating the contract. So there are two different things. Termination, you're talking about the paper. Cancellation is of the actual event. So all kinds of scenarios there. Joe and Todd could give you probably a plethora of circumstances, things they've learned through the years to attempt to plan for. But just know it probably won't all fit inside a document. And so that's what in often, these things come up in conversation. As he mentioned at the beginning, you've had these conversations and proposals. So those are typically the things that are included. Force majeure is a situation that unfortunately now we're all familiar with, which is where there's completely unforeseeable circumstances. In the past, it's quite difficult to use that, but now we have COVID-19, at which point every attorney in the nation was squawking about, what does that actually mean? Because we just really hadn't had a circumstance. So it's been incredible to see, kind of from a legal perspective, that play out. And I think now going forward, though, interestingly enough, COVID-19 won't really be seen as unforeseeable. So while if a contract was in place when that came up, you're fine, because that wasn't foreseeable at the time. But going forward now, you'll see pandemics and things like that, outbreaks and stuff, language like that in contracts. Mm-hmm. I think the other two terms I threw out, and I don't want to drag on too long.
Like airline tickets and stuff. People, airlines are saying if you buy a ticket now, the risks, and so you're not necessarily going to get your money back.
Kind of like we saw terrorist threats. You remember when terrorist threats was the first time to put that in a contract? That's right. And,
yes.
Kind of same thing. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but you're right, Joe. I mean, after 9/11, things changed. So, and think of your contract as an evolving document, right? I mean, you're going to have a kind of your standard form, but continue to evolve that as you learn more. You'll see that often in leases and things like that, where it'll take one instance of something, but you learn and then incorporate it into the document. So just think of it as kind of a living, breathing thing that you want to continuously update. So a couple of the other legal terms to throw in, we talked about indemnification, which I think, you touched on insurance, right? So indemnification is just a transfer of risk in a similar way that insurance is. In insurance, most people are familiar with the idea that you're paying a third party to take on the risk. And indemnification isn't all that much different. It's just a clause in the contract that delineates, who's at risk, or oftentimes will indemnify parties, kind of what they would call co-indemnification, or across the table, meaning if something happened on the part of the venue, the two parties wouldn't then become at odds with one another. So, you'll see very general indemnification clauses and then some more specific for event planning. I think I threw out another one and I've already forgotten what it was. So just as we go.
Severability. Did we talk about severability?
Severability, right. Yeah. So, every contract has multiple terms. And if you go to change the terms, or if one portion of the contract becomes unenforceable, what the severability clause says is that the contract is severable so that it is still enforceable for the remaining clauses. So I use this example, it's kind of silly, but it's like if you spilled ketchup on your shirt, you don't necessarily have to go change your pants. So you just think of a contract in that way, that it's, you're only going to impact that one particular clause. The rest of it remains in effect.
Yeah, I know we've talked about this before, but we've been really fortunate to never really have a case that went to court or anything like that. We've been very, very fortunate. Our clients have had a couple of things that we've been a part of that we've had to help them with. But it's kind of interesting because I think one of the things that Todd and I have especially chosen to do is take the high road, and we've been in a position where we can do that. So we've, like, for example, we had a client that it just became apparent to all of us this was not a good working relationship, and rather than holding them to their contract, we let them out of that easily, and they let us know that was great for them too, and it worked out great. And again, I think we left as friends saying, this is not an event for us. This is not a client that's going to be great for us. And so, and kind of the same way with a lot of the recent things, we've had a lot of cancellations because of COVID, obviously, something like 80 or no, it wasn't that. What was the number? 20 some? Anyway, horrible number. And again, we just kind of taken the idea that we're all in this together and we're trying to figure it out. And, no one's doing this wrong. So we're not going to really uphold those contracts in the way that we sometimes would. So I just had to toss that out, that I think that's just a good way to do business, I never want people to say, oh yeah, they're just contract happy because they're going to sue you tomorrow. And I never want to be that way. So
I do think that's a good thing to think about going forward with contracts. And, one of our points here is talking about COVID cancellation clause. And I think that's definitely something we all need to think about going forward. One thing I wanted to mention to everybody listening is we're offering our contract, a sample contract of our event contract. If you'll just email us and let us know you're interested in that, we can send you a Word file and you can edit it and use it as you want.
We're not, and definitely talk to your attorney about it. It's a starting point.
It's definitely a starting point. As Laura said, it's a living document. But what I'd like to do actually is, I didn't talk to Joe about this, but I want to include our COVID cancellation clause in that contract and be sure that's in there for people to look at and use if it makes sense for them.
So this is a question that's just kind of come to my mind. So you can say I don't know how to answer it. One of the things I think we get into sometimes is working in other states and delivering goods and that sort of thing, when we're working in other properties. And I know we work hard to make sure that we're, under Oklahoma laws, because that's where our company's based. And we work really hard to make sure we tell our clients, if they're an out-of-state client, hey, we're working under Oklahoma laws. This is where the agreement is. And that seems always right. I guess I know we've gotten into times where we have to readjust that and say, well, we're actually working in Texas this month, and so we're going to, work under the Texas laws and make sure that we're because we're having the event there or whatever the case is. A lot, and again, it gets a little. I know we have a Oklahoma client who has events in other places, and we're happy to do those, and we just do the whole thing under Oklahoma, and there comes some tax laws in that sort of thing. And our tax people have said, hey, as long as you're getting the checks from Oklahoma, they have an Oklahoma address, you're good, and you're fine even if your event is in Phoenix or in LA or wherever it may be. So help us a little bit about that. When do we need to be concerned about out-of-state stuff? When do we need to start thinking about, is this the same rule that applies there?
Yes, and that, first of all, a contract is definitely when you need to contemplate those things. So, again, when you're talking about scope of service, you should know where the event's going to take place, where the other party is from, and obviously your domicile or place of business. And so you have to consider those things. This is where, again, the plug for a local attorney is critical. There are definitely varying state laws, but more than just state laws, you have county, local ordinance, city-specific things that, can kind of throw a wrench in the cog if you're not careful. So to back up, I would say that's one clause I didn't mention that is important in most contracts, which is what they call a choice of law provision. And that's where the parties do agree to what law governs and what jurisdiction even or venue they would use should there be a dispute. I know, going back to what Joe said, I mean, contracts never replace communication, right? So you want your document to be as updated as possible. You want it to reflect the communication, but it certainly doesn't replace it. And so all of those things are things that you would need to discuss with your potential client or ongoing client, as far as what's most fair, what's most reasonable. And then oftentimes it would involve seeking the advice of local counsel in those areas to see what's most advantageous. At the end of the day, as Joe said, you don't want to end up in a legal action. You don't want to end up, having a dispute that you can't settle outside of court. And so, if everyone's upfront about those things, it's just far less likely to happen.
And we
Love
do
that.
have a clause in our. I was just reading clause number 5 is we agree to carry out this contract under this laws of the state of Oklahoma. So if somebody reads that and they're in, for say, California, they can say, no, we'd rather it be under the laws of California, and we can talk about that. And as long as we both agree on it, that's the important part, right?
Exactly. And, like Joe said, sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. So, but just understand that if you're agreeing to jurisdiction in that, in a particular state, then those are the state laws that are going to govern the contract.
I love that. I know the other thing that we work to always make sure we have, obviously, is the scope of work, like we've talked about over and over, but the date, the location. And I really, I've always loved, and I think, Laura, you gave me this first advice of put that end date in there, make that really clear that this is when the contract is over. And we determined years ago that that's really over like a week or two after the event. And that gives us time to wrap up. That gives us, make sure that it's really anything under, if we're delivering things to someplace after the event, it's still covered by that contract. And then also with that is the fee and payment schedule. We always ask our client kind of what they want their terms to be. We have always asked for all the payment to be made before the event happens. That works out great. Again, most of our clients at this point are repeat business. We've worked with them before, or they're people who come highly recommended, or they're large companies that we trust. We do research on, make sure that they pay their bills, that sort of thing. So it's really not a problem. We do have one organization recently that asks to pay half of it before their event and then half of it either as their event's ending. And we said, how about we come back and you just have a check for us when we leave the event, and that'll work out great. We'll be happy with that. But that way we're not chasing down money, months later, that sort of thing.
And that was an instance where this was the first time our company had worked with them as a client. So I think of a little bit of nervousness on their part, which.
Right. Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that, Laura? What are your thoughts on that?
No, but I do just want to bring up the point that, throughout this last few months when we've talked about COVID and so many contracts were in flux, right? So work had been done to a certain point. And it was something that Joe and Todd and I talked about a lot was, refundability. So it's important to not only have that payment schedule, but understand, at what point would any of those funds, if any at all, would be refundable and under what circumstances. So, I think, as Joe said, they've collectively taken the stance that, we're gonna do what's right, and we're all in this together, and we all understand, a notion of fairness. So, if they had accepted funds and felt as though they hadn't, carried out any portion of that work, then perhaps it would have been appropriate. But I think going forward, the payment schedule and the way in which you agree to take those, you just have to take into account, what happens if halfway through, or a third of the way through, or 3/4 of the way through. Think about the expenses that you have. And if the client, again, this is about communication. If they question why you're requesting a certain amount by a certain date, explain the advances that you're making. And I think for the most part, people are pretty reasonable. They would understand that you might not be able to get your money back. And so, there's dozens of circumstances that could play into that. But I think, maybe in the past there was just, as Joe explained, either all at the beginning or something of that nature. And I think you're going to see going forward people kind of wanting a more staged structure. I could be wrong, but
I think you're right. We do
if I had a crystal ball.
We do a lot of monthly payments, and I think that works really well. And I think our contract states that basically there's not a lot of refunds. We're paying for for services rendered sort of thing up to the event, and kind of the event is almost the in service rendered. And I think that's worked out really well for us in that, the few times we have had to sever a relationship or, an event canceled or whatever, it worked out fine because either we had a half deposit or we had something that kind of covered all the work that we had done. And it just, kind of makes sense to treat people that way and do that.
And event planning, the event planner vendor is a little bit different than the other vendors in an event, in that, like a caterer, they don't have a lot of preparation costs. It's all in the product that they're producing and serving at the event. Whereas the planner, I mean, their work is being done 9 months to a year before the event, all the way up to the event. And the event is a large piece of it, but it's not by any means the majority of the work that they're doing. It's all that upfront. I mean, that's why we're called planners, because we're planning. That's what we're providing, is the planning service. So if an event does get canceled close to when it happens, the majority of that work has been done.
Yeah, we actually had an event cancel for this September, and we were trying to figure out what was fair with our client. Our client said, "What's fair?" So we went back and just gave him a copy of all our hours, of exactly what hours we'd put into it. And that was a shock to him. I mean, I think it was a little bit of a surprise. And in the end, we're like, "Hey, don't worry about that, but we just want you to know this is what's going to happen." And it was so helpful, I think, to the end. And so, of course, we always do keep timesheets. We keep hours. We know what we've done, how much money we've spent. If we've, even down to printing, if we printed proposals, we know all those costs that have gone into a client. And so, again, we can kind of easily hand that back and say, "Hey, just so you know, or if this is helpful to you." And he was great. I mean, he was very, very appreciative of that. It was not in fact, he actually asked for it. I don't think it was quite the in your face I just made it sound like, but it was good. So
another clause that we added, I think at your direction, Laura, when we were first drafting our initial contract, was remedies for late payment. And that's, I have had contracts or agreements before where I regretted not having any sort of remedy for late payment, because if someone doesn't pay you, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing in the contract. I mean, you could file a lien, I guess, but I think that was a helpful. Certainly, we haven't had to use it, I don't think, but it's at least there to say, "Hey, you need to pay your bills on time," and it's in writing. You don't have to say it to your client.
Yeah, and it's perfectly reasonable to include some sort of late fee, or I hate calling it a penalty. That's what it kind of would be, but I think that's perfectly reasonable because there's been a delay. Perhaps this is a client you still want to maintain as a partner, and this was a temporary situation for them, but you're made whole. Plus, you're getting maybe a little, if you want to call it, interest in the form of a late fee, and I think that's completely reasonable. That's how the rest of the world operates. And so most people wouldn't really, bat an eye at seeing that in a contract, because it is something we're quite familiar with. So you're asking somebody to, delay accepting the payment, and, you just, again, walk a mile in their shoes. But there was something else I was going to bring up, and I just drew a blank. So
another one of our clauses was, I had to read it to Joe the other day when we were preparing for this podcast to really understand it, and but it's talking about your personnel and who's responsible for your personnel and who's going to take responsibility for them. And should I just read the
read the clause,
because it's an interesting clause. So it says, Rumble Drum LLC shall be solely responsible for personnel and their acts. Rumble Drums LLC's personnel shall act at Rumble Drum LLC's own risk, expense, and supervision, and Rumble Drum LLC personnel shall not have any claim against client for salaries, commissions, items of cost, or other compensation or reimbursement. Kind of fumbled through that, but
explain that to us, Laura.
Can you explain that a little bit? Joe tried to explain it to me. I mean,
I was very helpful in my explanation,
and I kind of understand it from what Joe said, but I'm sure you do a much better job.
So I would say, in a way, what that does is kind of controls who the parties to the agreement are. It narrows the scope by saying that, hey, you don't have to worry about our employees, right? That or our contract folks. They're they're one and the same as us. For multiple reasons, but I think that reassurance is important because the last thing you want is whether you've hired employees or just for the event or whether they're ongoing employees. The last thing you want is some sort of dispute between your staff and the client. You really want to take the lead in those situations, and again, I think it's a reassurance to them that everything needs to go back through you for communication. That it kind of just establishes who the parties are in a way, and then if you need to handle that issue, you can go do that if there is an issue at all. I would think it would probably be a rare instance, but it could certainly happen. I'm trying to remember, Joe, if we added that in response to a scenario. I sure
Is there a story there?
Well, I think there is a story there, and the one I'm remembering, and I'm trying to figure out how to best phrase it to protect all the innocent parties. But we had a situation where a client kind of promised an employee of ours, or actually a contract laborer of ours, someone in contract labor, some kind of benefit, a care, and we all understood it was going to be free. We all understood that, and then a couple of months later, the employer, or the contract laborer, got a bill for it, large bill, $4,000, and it eventually went to a credit reporting agency. And I went back to the client and just said, "Hey, I think this is something you offered for free." And they're like, "Oh, let me chase that down." And we did that a couple of times, and I felt like it was going to hurt our relationship. And it's one of those times I made the decision, I'm going to write this check and pay it. And it hurt. It really hurt me because it was at the time, it just felt like a lot more money than I needed to be dishing out for anything. But I put it in the scope of things of this was my responsibility because they're my contract labor person. It's mine. And I just need to make sure that if that client ever offers something like that again, I'm going to jump in the middle of it and make sure that we know what's going on if it's something that's going to be covered. So I think that might have been one of the reasons we put that in there, because we just want to make it really clear that they're our responsibility. They're not going to go back and if I don't pay them on time or something like that, they can't go back to the client and even ask for money or payment if there's something even out there like that. I think we also had a employee once who may have gone behind our back sometimes asking clients for hey, you can keep this if you'll just give me some money. And it was like, nope, we want to make sure that's taken care of. So
again, I mean, I would just stress that what the contract is for you to maintain good working relationships with your client. That's really what the whole focus has to be. Yes, there are legal protections afforded, but again, that's all with the overarching idea that this is, for the betterment of all involved. It's not a versus, it's not a court case, it's not a, he said, she said. So those are the things you want to avoid, and that's why it's important to take the time and ensure understanding on both sides. So yeah, I wish I didn't know about that incident.
Yeah, a couple of things I just want to ask real quick, just as we're kind of wrapping up. One of the things, what if a client says, I want to add a bunch of stuff to the contract. I got to take it through my legal people. They have lots of questions. They don't like this. They don't want this. What's your response to that? How do you handle that?
And you're talking about an instance where there wasn't a contract to start with.
Right.
You're trying to establish
a contract. We've sent it to them, said, here, sign this. They're like, hey, I just took this to legal.
I think he's baiting you, Laura, for the right answer. The right answer is you consult an attorney.
I was going to say, I think you're going to need your own attorney for that answer. But since I'm talking to you, that's difficult. But no, you're exactly right. You're going to have to, again, go back to, I was about to say go back to any proposals or any communication between the two of you. But frankly, those are difficult things to prove. So it's going to depend on the jurisdiction. It's going to depend on the choice of law that you're under. But most importantly, just consult an attorney on those topics.
And I think as we've tightened up our agreement and we've not had any of those questions that we've had before. And I know, before when I'd ask you, they're like, you would say like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Go ahead and accept that. Or, whatever their thing was. I think there was only a couple of times that we said, yeah, we're not really, and they probably had to do with terms of payment of, yeah, we're not communicating well what that means. And they're thinking deliverable goods on a certain date a year from now. And really there's deliverable goods all along the way. And they're just not understanding that in their legal department. So I think that's been very helpful. My last question is, what if they say, we don't do contracts, we don't do agreements? Is this necessary?
So I would be asking further questions. I would want to know why. I would want to know, there's got to be a reason for that, because I think, especially in today's world, contracts are just pretty much the way that we do business, frankly. So, that would, to me, be a bit of a red flag. It doesn't mean that it couldn't be done, but you would need to really consider the situation, I guess, overarching scope. I get asked often the question of, well, there wasn't a contract, and now what? Yes, evidence matters. If there's emails, if there's written communication and things like that. But keep in mind, evidence only truly matters in the court of law. So that your money, all the disputes. I 2020, it's generally accepted that, contracts are the way to go, and they are, bilateral joint agreements. And so, I can't think of an instance where it's a bad idea to have a contract. So
Yeah, that's good.
Love it. Yeah.
Well, this has been great, really helpful.
Love it.
Of course, I'm sure we're just scratching the surface of contracts, but just want to give people a taste of, what the attorney might think about a contract. And again, email us at todd@rumbledrum.com or joe@rumbledrum.com, and we'll shoot you a copy of the contract, and love to get that out to you and just help you along if that can help anybody.
It just means so much to us when you follow us, when you subscribe to us, when you like us on Facebook and Instagram. This has been such a great conversation, and we hope to have many more guests and conversations like today where we're getting input from an outside person and kind of how to do things. And so this has been really fun. Thank you, Laura, for your time and energy. Send us a bill, and thank you for your efforts to just make this a better world. And I think that's what this really comes down to is we want event planners to succeed. We want you to have fun doing the business. And this is definitely one of those business sides that they can just feel like, oh, I don't want to do it. But so crucial and important. So tune in next week. We've got some good stuff coming on in episode 18. And we're going to talk a little bit about audio visual, the other side of the company, and kind of what that looks like. And so we'd love to have you join us, another guest next
interview.
week.
Yeah,
another interview. So we're looking forward to that. And we'll tune in next week. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, everybody.
thanks.